because there's always something going on here. As I say, it's my honor to have the opportunity to talk about Jack White's work today, and I'm just going to jump into it. I struggle these days because I've now fallen over into the dark side of needing reading glasses. And so if I put them on, I can't see you, but if I take them off, I can't see this. So I'm going back and forth between the two. So I apologize that I'm probably going to be pulling off and putting on over the next 30 minutes or so. Okay. On a warm July evening, a midwife brought me screaming into the post-depression segregated world of Johnston County, North Carolina. The year was 1931. Thus, John Sidney Jack White described his birth. 71 years later, Dave Tobin, staff writer for the Syracuse Post-Standard, wrote, "Artist Jack White marks time. He marks places, emotions, memory, people, flights of imagination. For most of his 71 years, he has captured what his eyes and mind's eye see in a broad range of styles of drawings, paintings, collages. He has taught, sometimes in prisons, trying to unlock similar creative impulses in students, encouraging them to express their vision on paper or canvas." Jack White spent his youth in North Carolina, primarily in Raleigh, where his family moved when he was young. He described life in the segregated South as, quote, "a tough place to bring up Black children, but we took the cards we were dealt and got through it the best we knew how." Jack was creatively inclined from childhood. He loved comic books and drew his own comics. He also visited the North Carolina Museum of Art every Sunday after church. At the time, the museum was housed in a retired Supreme Court building downtown. The collection was not all that large, and I actually tried to get in touch with the museum to get some history about it, and they never got back to me. It's now in a really gorgeous, massive building full of contemporary art, kind of on the far side of Raleigh, I think. But at the time, it was in this building on the left. So it was in a historic structure, which is something that would become, I think, important to Jack White as he moved through his career. He had an appreciation for old places. But what was on the inside remains a bit of a conundrum. But all we do know is that it mattered to him, and he remembered really with fondness the opportunity to go see artwork so regularly. When he went to high school, he had to make a choice between bricklaying and woodshop, and he chose the latter. And that, I think, also is a bit of a statement about where he is going to lead with his career. He also took a mechanical drawing class, which he remembered as most enlightening, loving the isometric and orthographic planes. And a couple of decades later, he actually produced artwork that was inspired by the spirit of flight. And you can imagine the way in which this sort of geometry would appeal to someone who had that kind of interest. After high school, Jack enlisted in the Air Force, which took him for the first time to Texas. He trained in San Antonio and had that oh so Texan experience of first seeing the Alamo. He was underwhelmed, which is a very Texan experience of seeing the Alamo, I think. I wish we had a photo of young Jack White at the Alamo at the age of 18, but sadly we do not. But it was when Jack was sent overseas that he really dove into history and set out to explore his wonder for artistic expression. His first post overseas was in Tripoli, Libya. And for those of you who aren't entirely sure where Tripoli is, I wasn't actually. It's kind of straight south of Sicily. So that's where he was. He recalled that he was, quote, "in seventh heaven, a new country, 3 different languages, and weather to die for. What a new learning experience. We were right on the Mediterranean with Spain, France, Italy, and Greece, just a boat trip or a flight away." Jack quickly took advantage of his surroundings, visiting Benghazi and then learned of the Roman ruins at Leptis Magna. He went alone, unable to convince any of his friends to join him. He was struck by the Forum, the amphitheater, library, and bathhouses, his first in-person experience of ancient art and architecture. When he had leave from the base, he traveled to Copenhagen via Athens, taking in the Parthenon during his one day there. In Copenhagen, he focused on the National Museum, the Little Mermaid statue, and Tivoli Gardens. He enjoyed Copenhagen so much that he lost track of time and accidentally went AWOL. Only the quick intervention of a friend on base who altered his leave dates saved him from a court-martial. And this friend had refused to go with him to Lapis Magna. So he was frustrated. This was a friend from home, and he thought that they were going to have all these adventures together, but he realized that his friend was more interested in playing basketball and less interested in seeing ancient archaeological sites. But he saved him when he accidentally didn't come back. After 4 years in the Air Force, Jack mustered out, his eyes set on college. He looked at multiple options, but ultimately, a cousin's experience and local family encouraged him to move to Baltimore to attend Morgan State University, where he pursued a fine arts degree, graduating in 1958. The art department was led by James Lewis, who ran the studio program, and Dr. Charles Stalling, who taught art history. And this is James Lewis on the left. He was a sculptor, and that is an image of him in his studio. And on the right, you're actually seeing a modern gallery at the James Lewis Museum of Art at Morgan State University. He was relatively early in his tenure when Jack was enrolled there. He arrived in 1950 and had trained at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia. In any case, he was there for 36 years, and over that period of time amassed a collection of over 3,000 objects for the Art Museum, which, as I say, now bears his name. So you can see that it wasn't just the practice of creating art that mattered to Lewis. It was the experience of seeing art, which is something that Jack has already shown from childhood to be something that he valued as well. The highlight of Jack's sophomore year was a visit to the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. Eccentric inventor and collector Albert Barnes established the Barnes Collection in 1922 in Marion, Pennsylvania. As an item of interest, since we happen to be in Austin today, the architect he hired to design the galleries was none other than Paul Kret, the architect of the UT Tower. So anyway, nice little connection to us. Barnes had made his fortune as one of the inventors of Argyrol, an antiseptic silver compound used to combat gonorrhea and inflammations of the eyes, ears, nose, and throat. And that is the sum total of what I know about that. Conveniently for him, it just doesn't sound like a thing that you want to ingest, if you ask me. Conveniently for him, he sold his company months before the stock market crashed in 1929. But by this time, he had already amassed hundreds of paintings and sculptures, primarily French Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings and African sculptures. Barnes considered the museum campus primarily to be a school, and as such, he limited public visits to only 2 days a week. In 1961, after a decade of legal challenges following his death in 1950, public access expanded a whopping 1/2 day to 2.5 days a week, and no more than 500 visitors a week. My mother, when she attended Bryn Mawr outside of Philadelphia in the 1960s, said that gaining access to the Barnes was like gaining access to Fort Knox, and that over her 4 years in college, she repeatedly entered the lottery, and she made it through once in 4 years. Barnes was a social justice advocate and an intellectual idealist. He instituted courses of study within his company, and that company is making this medication, right? Bringing artwork to his office and devoting 2 hours of the workday to seminars. And when he established his foundation, he designated that the HBCU, Lincoln University, control 4 out of the 5 trustee positions. So this is the collection that Jack White had an opportunity to visit in the mid-1950s. Was it easier because he attended an HBCU? Quite likely. But whatever the circumstances, Jack had the opportunity to engage with an incredibly high caliber art collection and to see the ways Barnes connected European and African artwork. Barnes preferred representational artwork. He said that painting's natural vocabulary could be found in the, quote, elements of representation. And he rejected Cubism as having broken that vocabulary by removing attachment to the concrete object. He had a real conflicted relationship with Pablo Picasso for this reason. He loved Picasso's work, and anyway, but as he became increasingly Cubist, he lost interest in it. You have our celebrated Cézanne, Van Gogh, Modigliani. You see a couple of Modiglianis in this image, Matisse, and others for retaining their three-dimensional grounding within a modernist framework. African art played a major role in the Barnes collection, and you can see that in this image. And indeed, Barnes was one of the first to celebrate African art for its inherent aesthetics and to credit African artists for artistic invention, while other early 20th century critics considered African artists to be, quote, instinctual, and thus excluded from the pantheon of great artists. In support of a new understanding of African art and to publicize the Barnes Foundation collection, the foundation published Primitive Negro Sculpture in 1925. Barnes was not an author, though he was deeply involved in the creation of the book. As a landmark volume at the time, Barnes helped to shape the conversation about what defined excellence in African art and simultaneously showcased his own collection, as all of the works in the book were his. Consistent with this scholarly focus, the Barnes Foundation building itself prioritized African motifs. Barnes commissioned infield tile works to design the surround for the entryway of the building, incorporating tile adaptations of African artwork within the collection. This thus becomes the visitor's entry point into the broader collection. And these are 4 different cultural expressions. On the left, Sudan style, Abamana figure, Sudan style. Then the second is Bao figure, Ivory Coast, a Fang reliquary, Garian figure, Gabon, and a Bembe figure, Congo. The one on the right was actually a replica of a piece in Paul Guillaume's collection. Paul Guillaume was the dealer in Paris who supplied Barnes with basically his entire African sculpture collection. And anyway, it was in his collection. The other represent works in the foundation collection that then the tile works translated into something that could be put on the wall. So Jack later wrote of his visit, the collection was spellbinding, with Cézanne's, Renoir's, Modigliani's, Van Gogh's, Picasso's in a marvelous mansion with exotic gardens in a hard-to-find suburb of Philadelphia. It took me back many years and reminded me when I used to walk across Salisbury Street to the North Carolina Museum of Art. This one trip set in motion a stronger caring for fine art and, as a new art major, a need to become as creative as I could be. It's interesting that Jack didn't mention the African artwork he saw juxtaposed against Western painting and sculpture, for over the course of his career, he would produce multiple series, including sculpture series of totems inspired by his own African heritage. Jack White's graduation from Morgan State in 1958 was itself memorable, as his commencement speaker was a young preacher, Martin Luther King Jr. And that's the second photograph I really wish I had of Jack White receiving his diploma from Martin Luther King Jr. After graduation, Jack was offered a position as a public school art teacher and left for New York State, which would remain his primary home for the better part of the next 4 decades. So returning to Dave Tobin's 2002 review, it can be difficult to know where to start with Jack White's work, since, as Tobin noted, he worked in a broad range of styles and media over the course of his career. The work on the walls that surround us bear this out. Jack worked in a variety of media and with more or less interest in representational narrative over the course of his career, primarily less. What we see today here is a cross-section of his work that remained primarily within his own collection. Though seemingly eclectic, the patterns you see amongst the work on view betray the artist's interest in series. We see series of punch cards, series of totems, series of pen and ink drawings, and a consistent return to geometric shapes. Jack began, as we've heard, as so many children do, by drawing. And he enjoyed comic books, creating his own, and then found in class that he had a facility for representational drawing and for mechanical drawing. And that push-pull between representation and abstraction resurfaced again and again across his career. The pen and ink drawings in this exhibition date to the latter part of Jack's career, during the 1990s, when he and his wife Valerie spent time in both Cuba and in Greece. Consider this image of the National Schools of Art in Cuba. The image layers geometry upon geometry. At first glance, all you see are rectangles, but then a scene emerges. Chairs surround a table in the foreground, and you realize that you're looking through a window across the street at another building full of windows. And you get the sense that the geometry of the scene was of far greater interest to the artist than the context of the buildings themselves. The same can be said of two drawings of scenes from his time in Greece. On the right, surfaces are stacked in what appear at first to be a jumbled mess. The seemingly flat image jumps into 3 dimensions when we realize that a large cafe umbrella cantilevers out towards us from the center of the composition. On the left, you see the exterior of an apartment he and Valerie stayed in Parmenidou. I'm particularly taken with this image, where the structure loses its 3-dimensionality to the hodgepodge of surfaces, with the rock, shutters, tile roof, and landing all competing for our eye. I wish Jack had known about the Neill-Cochran House Museum during his time in Austin. Imagine how his eye would have been drawn to the rock surfaces of the slave quarters. Throughout his career, Jack was known as an abstract expressionist. And this is actually a remembrance of him that I found online from, can't remember, the Austin Visual Arts Association. While I would argue that he was much more than an abstract expressionist, certainly elements of his work fit into that style. So, what is abstract expressionism? As much as a style, abstract expressionism was a movement that developed in the post-World War II period and emerged initially out of New York. The artists most connected to abstract expressionism, Jackson Pollock, you see here, Franz Klein, Mark Rothko, Elaine and William de Kooning, moved in the same circles and saw themselves as creating something new. With the male artists, often there was an element of the physical and machismo embedded in their work. Within abstract expressionism, 2 primary groups emerged. Those who were called action painters, like Jackson Pollock, who activated their canvases through overtly physical paint application, and color field painters, like Mark Rothko, who focused on the power of color and its contemplative possibilities. I don't think I'm saying that word right. When Jack White graduated from college in 1958, he graduated into the height of abstract expressionism, and much of his work does share characteristics with that style. Look, for instance, at this untitled mixed media collage. This is a physical piece. The manipulation of the cardboard and the layering of paint with mangled paper centers the artist's hand in action. And yet, the background, royal blue canvas, looks a little bit more blue on the screen than it does over there. And the division of the cardboard into linear strips invites contemplation. This, then, is an abstract expressionist hybrid, neither full action nor full color field. Painting for an Elegant Lady, another mixed media on canvas, reinforces characteristics we just saw, although on a much larger scale, and also introduces new content. This large format work is a triptych, with a large square canvas at the center and rectangular wing panels on either side. And it's right behind you. These wings each feature a vertical strip of paint that at first appears painted on the surface, but on closer reflection is a strip of underpainting. If you look carefully, you'll also see a bit of the kind of red pink emerging, breaking through the surface to the lower right-hand side. In other words, the reds, pinks, and white are all embedded within that dark gray, which therefore incorporates the warm tones, even if they're barely visible to the viewer. There's a painter named Ad Reinhard who painted all of these black paintings. I mean, they were called black paintings, a whole series of black paintings. None of them were black. When you look really carefully, it's all about what colors, what pigments were embedded in the black. And that's what you're seeing here as well. This contrasts with what appears to be the tape. Oh, sorry. The surface as well might initially appear to be flat, but in fact, the artist's hand is visible throughout, both in the impasto that sits on the lower portion of the left-hand panel and in active brushstrokes throughout. And the impasto you see that right there? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as well as elsewhere, but it's most clearly evident there. This contrasts with what appears to be tape that the artist placed to cover a portion of the underlayer and then removed to expose the lines we see. The artist thus juxtaposes the intimacy of the visible brushstroke with the distancing of the mechanical act of laying tape. The center canvas, in contrast, brings the viewer and the artist into close collaboration. It's our job to see within the canvas, looking for the layering that adds depth, and then exploring the rectangles and the square within the square. The central piece, a collage, introduces us to a new subject that was for several decades a critical component of Jack's process, the computer punch card. Jack first became aware of punch cards during the 1960s. This mechanization of knowledge, he came across them due to their use by anthropologists and ethnographers to record data about African art and artifacts, was anathema to his own hands-on approach to artistic production. The fact that the data, the cards recorded, was personal to him, not just the product of artistic expression, but of African culture and aesthetics, deepened his dislike of the technology. By incorporating punch cards into his own work, he appropriated them and destroyed them, not just by painting over their surfaces, but here by mangling and stacking them, voiding any content that they originally carried. Jack was not an art historian, but he showed over the course of his life a curiosity for the Western art historical canon, taking advantage of every opportunity to visit a museum or travel. Part of the power of painting for an elegant lady lies in its format, the triptych, a well-known structure for spiritual images, typically with the image of Christ at the center. When he visited Copenhagen back in the 1950s, he would have seen triptychs such as this early 16th Northern German example. Looking at the two together, the punch cards become a central motif of sacrifice and martyrdom. And that's like the most out there art historical statement I'm going to make today, but I believe it. Another major collage on view covers the surface of the canvas with punch cards sitting over punched ledger paper. And to kind of talk you through that, so these are punch cards. These things that kind of look like bricks. They're all punch cards. And then if you look carefully, it's kind of hard to see. And there we go. This is the easiest place to see. So do you see those dots right there? And there? That is that typewriter ledger paper that you used to have the holes in order to keep it in the typewriter. Yeah. So you're seeing that on either side here and here. And so essentially the punch cards are sitting on top of ledger paper. Okay. The artist here built depth, not just through the layering of computer punch cards, but through the blending and building of color that appears almost lacquered to the surface, suspending the cards in a sort of decoupage, removing the punch cards from their academic environment. And if you look carefully, you can also see, easier to do, please do look at this separately once we're done. But here's one where you can see, do you see the holes in the card right there? Those are all punches, and you can see them. The closer you get, the more of them you'll see. So removing the cards from their academic environment, the color choices appear almost industrial, as if the paint choices are metals in various stages of oxidation. However, as with the artist's other work, the distancing collapses as you register the masterful use of color and the intimacy of the gestures of the brushstroke. Ultimately, the holes in the punch cards welcome rhythm and texture for a very human creation. One interesting note regarding this collage, while we see it today as a horizontal image, earlier in its life, Jack initially intended it as a vertical design. If you look closely, you can see he signed the work in the lower right quadrant, hung vertically. And that's a detail of it, and where you see it, right there. We don't know why he changed his mind, but for me, the horizontal scene, with cards running out to left and right, is reminiscent of a landscape, and possibly of a sunrise or a sunset. Horizontally, the image draws me in more readily than it does as a vertical design. As I say, we don't know why he made that choice, but he made that choice because it's hung, right? It's not, you can't just, this isn't like a Michael's frame where you can turn it whichever direction you feel like. It is strung to be hung this way. Jack held on to punch cards for decades, continuing to incorporate them into works large and small. And his view of the negative potential of technology never waned. Jack created this intimate work on the left in 1993, and you're seeing that's to give you a sense of scale, it's that upper right cabinet. So he created this intimate work on the left in 1993, 25 years after he began experimenting with punch cards. And note the similarities between this work and others: the destruction of the cards, the layering, the verticality, and the columns. Another decade passed before he created the collage on the right, a totem which juxtaposes a floppy drive, already obsolete by the time he incorporated it into this work in 2006, with layered computer punch cards. One layer of obsolescence provides the platform for another, later, obsolescent technology. This is, I find, a very funny image. In a statement about the ephemeral quality of these seeming advances. And I'll also say, Will Van Overbeck, who exhibited his work here last spring, he's a photographer, and he does a lot of work with digital photography now, but his view is digital is nothing. It doesn't exist. It does, but he doesn't believe that anything that is just data is permanent. So you've got this kind of irony, actually, because it won't degrade, but he just keeps saying, he said, who knows what we'll be storing on next? We've lost the CD, we've lost the DVD, we've lost the floppy drive, we've lost the hard drive, we've lost all of these things. So anyway, Will, I think, would have agreed. I think they would have sat down and had a very long conversation over multiple drinks and would have been violently in agreement with one another. To drive home the floppy drive's lack of utility, the artist has painted the tongue gray, rendering it unusable. Just as with the punch cards we see to the left, we've lost any attempt to find meaning here. That floppy drive could contain a dissertation, years of taxes, or the record of 7,000 solitaire games. Who can say? This small collage bridges us to another critical component of Jack White's production, his series, and there were multiple, of totems. All of the totems on display in the gallery are from the artist's Neo-Totem series from the 2000s. Each combines acrylic paint, a wooden structure, and copper embellishments. So if you compare these three totems right here, copper designs and their tripart constructions that echo the human body, heads, torsos, and legs, emerge from geometric abstraction. One of the challenges of an exhibition like this one, drawn from the artist's own collection, is that it is necessarily incomplete, based on what he did not sell or that he produced for himself or his loved ones. We are missing much of the African-inspired work of his career. To give you a sense, here are the names of some of his so-called Afro series. Hail Afro was first in 1969, followed by the Afro Mask Forms, and this right here is Afro Mask Form number 24, so it's from that series. Neo-Afro, Afro Mask Shield, Kente, and the African Form series. Much of this work was painted rather than sculptural. The Afro Mask Form series, for instance, was made up of paintings inspired by a confluence of Cubism and African art. Reflecting on his career, Jack wrote in the early 2000s about the impact his African heritage had had on him. Like most human beings, I'm curious about my ancestors. As a Black American, I know only that they came from the continent of Africa. The art and artifacts of the West African Kingdom of Benin inspire my new body of work. I believe it to be my most meaningful and significant work so far, but this is not the first time I've used African symbolism. In the late 60s and early 70s, I created two series called Hail Afro and the African American Form, and these are both from Hail Afro. In those paintings, the mask, the shield, and fabric were my source of inspiration. The works included in the Ancestral Leaning series are outside the boundaries of traditional painting. They contain elements of the spiritual, the artistic, and the utilitarian that define African art. I hesitate to put them in a category. I only know that in a very special way, they connect me with my African ancestors. Returning to the totems, consider the materials as well as the vertical forms and the ways in which the geometry of the totems resolves itself into an approximation of the human form. Jack said he looked particularly at Benin artwork for inspiration. The figure you see here from the Barnes Foundation collection is representational and features intricately detailed fabrics. While it would have been reductive to say that Jack White copied a work like this in any way, note how he balances the broad, smooth sections of each totem with detailing. He also used copper as an embellishment, a material often used by the Benin. And in his copper detailing, you see a similar interest in geometric design to that of the Benin male figure. Throughout his career, Jack White demonstrated the importance of his African heritage had for him in his work. However, he never claimed to be an expert on Africa. In fact, in earlier series, he incorporated Swahili newsprint precisely because he did not understand the language. His work seeks to state directly that to be African American is not to be African, nor can it be. Jack White was many things: an American, a military veteran, a father, a teacher, and someone who proudly bore the legacy of his African heritage. The remainder of the works I want to consider today were very personal to the artist. Two bring us into the sphere of his personal life with his wife Valerie, and the third connects him to decades of his life's work as a teacher. In an unpublished memoir the family has been generous to share with me, Jack wrote at length about his personal life, and I think it would be fair to say that he was not always pleased with the way he navigated his world, but that he muddled through as best as he could, as do we all through the challenges that life throws at us. It cannot have been easy to be a working artist and a teacher, and I know many of us have had experiences where we have had to balance professional opportunities against the difficulties they can create for personal relationships. That is no less true of an artist than anyone else. But over a very few short weeks in 1989, this all changed when Jack and Valerie met. The whimsical and intimate collage on the left tells the story. They met at the end of August, and by September 21st, they had committed themselves to one another for the rest of their lives. Jack and Valerie had hit blackjack, and they both knew it. The pastel on the right provides a peek into their life together 6 years in 1995, a far more representational piece than anything else on view in this exhibition. And you can see in the strength of the lines and the power of the pastel that Jack remained a master of drawing, even if his public work had moved in entirely different directions. The reason Jack and Valerie met was for a job. Valerie had been granted the directorship of the Inmate Higher Education Program at Cayuga Community College in Auburn, a program that offered incarcerated men the opportunity to earn an associate's degree. Valerie hired Jack to work as an art instructor in the medium security facility in Moravia. This was far from his first experience working with incarcerated people. His first posting was at the Hillbrook Detention Center, and he referred to his work as, quote, one of the most rewarding jobs, teaching art to kids in trouble with the law. He went on, I worked with kids in trouble who had missed so much of their education. They totally adapted to being creative. I truly enjoyed teaching them. But when the year 1995 came rolling in, I said a sad goodbye. This was about 25 years after he had started. While he was working at one of his first prison postings in Auburn in the early 1970s, Jack taught a young inmate named Joel Gaines. This is not Joel Gaines. However, Joel Gaines painted this painting. Gaines had never painted before becoming incarcerated, but he not only learned to paint, he exhibited while incarcerated through the New York State's Correction on Canvas initiative, in which works of art created by incarcerated individuals hung at the State House in Albany. Upon his release, Gaines became a professional painter and remained active until his death in 2006. We do not know who Freddie Ortiz was, the subject of this painting, unfortunately. But Jack held on to this large format portrait for 5 decades across multiple moves and his retirement. And I hope he knew that Gaines worked professionally for so many years after his release. I want to end today by thanking Valerie and Gia, Jack's daughter, for their enthusiasm for this exhibition and for entrusting his work to the NCHM this summer. I also want to share that Valerie is downsizing and has brought many of Jack's books here to the NCHM. They're all available out in the hallway for $10 a book, with proceeds going to support the museum. So spend some time with his collection and perhaps take a book or two home with you today. It's not too early to be thinking about Christmas. These would be a very cost-effective gift for someone, I'm sure. It's been a true honor to present this work to Austinites and our more far-flung visitors. With everything we do at the museum, we work to bring light to the importance of history, of heritage, and of community. Jack White's life and career speak to the important roles public and private institutions play in developing young minds and in providing springboards for achievement. And the intersectionality of his work speaks to the importance of looking at the world around you and allowing your curiosity to guide you. We certainly are the beneficiaries that Jack White saw the world this way. Thank you.